Hello Planeswalkers! Andrew here with another deck tech. In today's video we'll be going over a deck I like to call Master the Elements, that's led by Omnath, Locus of the Roil. River Omnath hits any target for damage equal to the number of elementals we control whenever it enters the battlefield. And whenever a land enters under your control, you can put a +1/+1 counter on an elemental you control, and if you control 8 or more lands when this happens, you also get to draw a card. River Omnath truly embodies the 3 colors that make up Temur. In this deck we focus on generating plenty of card advantage and dropping lots of elementals and lands, taking advantage of landfall triggers. Let's jump into our first segment. I've split up our ramp this time into 2 categories, one that's primarily mana ramp and one that's primarily land ramp, since landfall is a big part of this strategy. For mana rocks, we have Soul Ring and Chromatic Lantern, the latter of which lets us tap all of our lands for any color of mana, including lands that normally don't tap for mana at all. Our creatures in this category are Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Nyxbloom Ancient, and Smoke Braider. The Dryad lets us play another land each turn, and makes all of our lands into every basic land type, effectively doing what Chromatic Lantern does in a slightly different way. Nyxbloom Ancient is a favorite of mine. It's a creature that triples the amount of mana generated whenever you tap a permanent for mana, and it's also conveniently an elemental. Smoke Braider can tap for 2 mana of any color combo, but it can only be used either to cast elemental spells or to activate the abilities of elementals you control. A paltry drawback given the heavy emphasis on elementals in this deck. We've also got Zendikar Resurgent, which says that whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your pool of any type that land produced. Our land ramp is a more bulky grouping of cards consisting mainly of sorceries. Cultivate lets you grab 2 basic lands from your deck and add 1 to your hand and the other to the battlefield. Explosive Vegetation lets you put 2 basic lands from your deck onto the battlefield. Farseek grabs you a basic land of any type other than a forest and puts it onto the battlefield. Kodama's Reach does the same thing as Cultivate. Nylea's Intervention is an X-cost spell that can either grab you X lands from your library and put them into your hand, or deal twice X damage to each creature with flying. Rampant Growth puts 1 land from your deck onto the battlefield tapped. We also have 1 instant in Harrow, which has you sacrifice a land and then put 2 basics from your deck onto the battlefield untapped. Additionally, we run Burgeoning, which lets us play a land from our hand whenever an opponent plays a land. For creatures, we have Sakura Tribe Elder, Mina and Den, and Fertilid. The Elder can be sacrificed to search your library for a basic land card and put it onto the field tapped. Mina and Den let you play an extra land each turn, and Fertilid enters the field with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and you can pay to remove a counter from it to search your library for a land and put it onto the field tapped. This card synergizes well with River Omnath, since the land entering triggers Omnath's ability to put a counter on an elemental and draw you a card. You pay into Fertilid to remove a counter and put a basic land onto the field from your deck, triggering Omnath and letting you draw a card and put a counter back onto the Fertilid. Now that we've gone over the cards that help us grab more lands, let's go over our creatures and the cards that generate more creatures. We run Flamekin Harbinger, which lets us search for an elemental card in our library and move it to the top of the deck. Multani, Yavimaya's avatar, is as big as the number of lands we control, and can be brought back to our hand from the graveyard if we pay some mana and return 2 lands to our hand. Omnath, Locus of Rage, has a landfall trigger that makes a 5/5 elemental token. Overgrowth Elemental puts a +1/+1 counter on another elemental you control when it enters, and when another creature dies, you gain 1 life. If that creature was an elemental, you get a +1/+1 counter onto Overgrowth Elemental. Thicket Crasher has Trample and gives your other elementals Trample as well. Titania, Protector of Argoth, recurs a land from your grave when she enters, and whenever a land you control is put into the grave from the field, you create a 5/3 elemental. With Titania and Angry Omnath on the field, you get an elemental whenever a land enters or leaves the battlefield, essentially. Undergrowth Champion has Landfall, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it's dealt damage while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, prevent that damage and remove a counter. Our creatures that make more creatures, as in a lot of creatures, I know Angry Omnath and Titania already make more creatures, you smartass, are Avenger of Zendikar and Tilonali's Summoner. Tilonali's Summoner, I can speak. Marvel's Avenger makes a 0/1 plant creature token for each land you control when it enters the battlefield, and it puts a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control as a landfall effect. For Tilonali's Summoner, a personal favorite of mine, you can pay X and a red when she attacks, and then she creates X 1/1 elemental tokens that are tapped and attacking. She also has Ascend, which gives you the City's Blessing effect for the rest of the game if you control 10 or more permanents while the summoner's on the field. The tokens she creates are exiled at the next end step, unless you have the City's Blessing. In addition to the creatures, we also run Field of the Dead and Zendikar's Roil. Field of the Dead and any landfall deck is a match made in heaven, since you'll be dropping tons of lands to fuel FOD's effect. Zendikar's Roil says whenever a land enters under your control, it creates a 2/2 elemental. Have Angry Omnath, Titania, FOD, and Zendikar's Roil, drop Lotus Field, sacrificing 2 lands and triggering Angry Omnath and Zendikar's Roil and FOD, as well as triggering Titania twice, and generate 4 elementals and a zombie for dropping 1 land. Amazing value. Lastly, Rebel Hope's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control, and it has Blood Rush, letting you add power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control to target attacking creature. Our next category is Card Advantage, which is where I'm roping in card draw effects as well as Graveyard Recursion, which I feel the need to say since Crucible of Worlds and Ramanap Excavator recur specifically lands, and could be seen as either Land Ramp or Card Advantage. They both let you play lands directly from the graveyard. Handy, since some of our effects dump lands into the grave. Explore and Growth Spiral are similar in that they do multiple different things, with the former letting us play an additional land the turn we play it and then drawing us a card, and the latter drawing us a card and then letting us put a land from our hand onto the battlefield for free. Elemental Bond has us draw a card whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters our side of the field. Green Warden of Marasa grabs us any card from the grave when it enters, and when it dies, we can choose to exile it to do it again. Guardian Project is a card that I'm convinced was made purely for Commander and Brawl, which draws us a card whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, as long as it does not share a name with another creature you control or in your graveyard. Maelstrom Wanderer gives our creatures haste, and has the rare Double Cascade, which has you exile cards off the top of your library when it enters, and then you do this until you exile a non-land card that costs less than Maelstrom Wanderer. Then you can cast it without paying its mana cost. After that, the exiled cards go to the bottom of your library in a random order. Then, you do it again. Mole Drifter is a happy little flying fish that draws you 2 cards when it enters, and it has Evoke for 2 and a blue, which basically lets you cast it on the cheap for the downside of having to sacrifice it when it enters, effectively turning it into a 3-mana draw 2 cantrip. Risen Reef is the MVP of this deck, which has you look at the top card of your library when it or another elemental enters under your control. If the card is a land, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped, and if it's anything other than a land, you put it into your hand. This is the card that lets you pull a lot of shenanigans. Remember the combo I mentioned earlier that makes you 4 elementals and a zombie? Well, those 4 elementals would each trigger Risen Reef. The value this card generates can get out of hand really fast in the best way. Soul of the Harvest draws you a card whenever a non-token creature enters under your control. There's a theme when it comes to card draw in green. They'll give green players card draw, but only if they play lots of creatures. Splendid Reclamation returns all lands from your grave to the battlefield tapped. Tatiova basically has landfall, gain a life, and draw a card, although it's not called landfall technically. Finally, Urban Evolution draws us a hearty 3 cards, then lets us play an additional land the turn that we cast it. Vanquisher's Banner has you choose a creature type when it enters, and it gives creatures of that type +1/+1, and draws you a card whenever you cast a spell of the chosen type. I'm pretty lazy when it comes to naming strategies in these decks. Commander's Quarters does a much better job at coming up with snappy names for their strategies, and I try to emulate that in my deck titles more so than my strategy titles. And to that end, I present to you yet another deck tech of mine to feature the Support Strategy. How original! Our Planeswalkers in this deck are all Chandra, literally. We run Acolyte of Flame, Awakened Inferno, Flamecaller, and Torch of Defiance, as well as Chandra's Regulator. Her Regulator is basically a toned-down version of the Chain Veil, but only for Chandra cards. Acolyte can make us elementals, as well as support our other Chandras with extra loyalty counters. Awakened Inferno puts hurt emblems on our opponents as a freakin' +2. Flamecaller makes temporary elementals, adding to our commander's effect. Torch of Defiance lets us play the top card of our library, by first exiling it, adds mana to our pool, zaps something for 4, and can give us an emblem that hits something for 5 whenever we cast a spell. Evolution Sage proliferates whenever a land enters under our control. Forgotten Ancient gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a player casts a spell, and at the start of your upkeep you can move any number of +1/+1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. Incandescent Soulstoke is an elemental lord that can also tap for 1 and a red to put an elemental card from your hand onto the battlefield, granting it haste for the turn. It's then sacrificed at the next end step. Panharmonicon doubles up the ETB effects for creatures and artifacts entering under your control, making things like River Omnath and Marvel's Avenger more powerful when they enter. Rhythm of the Wild is the best Gruul enchantment, making your creatures and spells uncounterable and giving non-token creatures you control Riot, which lets you choose between a +1/+1 counter or haste when they enter. Roil Elemental has Landfall, gain control of target creature for as long as you control Roil Elemental. It's a good way of giving Kozilek, the Great Distortion, the proverbial middle finger. You can't counter me playing a land. And now you're mine, you giant tentacly son of a gun! Simic Ascendancy can be paid into to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. And whenever any number of +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters onto Simic Ascendancy. At the start of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. Temur Ascendancy gives your creatures haste and draws you a card whenever a creature with power 4 or more enters under your control. Now, if only we could get Gruul and Izzet Ascendancy, then we'd have the true Temur Ascendancy. Does that mean we'd also have to get an Ascendancy for red, blue, and green? Whatever, moving on. For defense, we've got counterspells in Counterspell and Negate, as well as targeted removal in Beast Within, Chaos Warp, and Krosan Grip. Beast Within destroys target permanent and replaces it with a 3/3. Chaos Warp shuffles a permanent into its owner's library and replaces it with the top card of their library, assuming it's also a permanent. And Krosan Grip has a split second, meaning it can't be responded to, and destroys target artifact or enchantment. Next, we've got Cyclonic Rift, which returns a non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, and can be overloaded to return everyone's non-land permanents to their hand, except yours. Now we come to our land base, where we have the ever-present Command Tower, as well as a Reliquary Tower to remove our hand limit. Evolving Wilds brings mana fixing, Karn's Bastion can proliferate for 4 mana, and Lotus Field packs a tasty 3 mana per tap, with the added bonus of dumping 2 lands into our grave to later be recurred, causing more landfall triggers. Frontier Bivouac is the Temur Tri-Land, or at least that's the practical reason why we run it. Frontier Bivouac also has some nice card art, like Frontier Bivouac has a giant skull on it, like something out of Subnautica, and there's a Temur camp set up under the skull in the art for Frontier Bivouac. Can you tell that I like saying Frontier Bivouac? Reminds me of the sound the alligators in Donkey Kong Country 2 make when you jump on them. Bivouac. Anyways, we run the dual lands that can turn into elementals, those being Lumbering Falls and Raging Ravine. Breeding Pool, Stomping Ground, and Steam Vents enter tapped unless we pay 2 life. Gruul Turf, Izzet Boilerworks, and Simic Growth Chamber return a land you control to its owner's hand when they enter, which lets us replay the lands that we return, bringing us even more landfall triggers. Hinterland Harbor enters tapped unless you control a forest or an island. Rootbound Crag and Sulphur Falls have similar effects. Finally, Temple of the False God taps for 2 colorless, but only if we control at least 5 lands, which is pretty easy in this deck. We also run 3 mountains, 11 forests, and 3 islands. And there you have it! A strong Temur Elemental deck that has the potential to snowball beyond your opponent's control. With this deck, you should be able to build an actual army of elementals and/or plants and/or zombies, and absolutely thrash your opponents with them. Proper use of landfall effects will see you well when piloting this deck. It's a shame that Panharmonicon doesn't affect lands entering. Yarok the Desecrated does, but he and Omnath only share 2 colors, so neither can go in the other's deck. Sad. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and a comment down below. Tell us what you think. If you want to see more from us in the future, think about tossing a sub our way. Have a great day, y'all.